In the spring of 1909, a regional Arizona newspaper called the Phoenix Gazette published a story that, if true, would have rewritten the history of the American Southwest and perhaps the history of the continent itself. The article, dated April 5th, described the discovery of a massive underground complex in the Grand Canyon, filled with artifacts that appeared to be Egyptian in origin, discovered by an explorer named G. Kinkaid, who claimed to be working under the direction of the Smithsonian Institution. The article was detailed. It included descriptions of carved stone chambers, hieroglyphic inscriptions, mummies, and relics of a civilization that had no business being in Arizona. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the story vanished. The Smithsonian denied any knowledge of Kinkaid or the expedition. No follow-up articles were published. No evidence was produced. And for over a century, researchers have debated whether the story was a hoax, a misidentification, or the deliberate suppression of a discovery that did not fit the accepted timeline of human history in North America. But there is another part of this story that the Phoenix Gazette article did not include, a part that exists only in the oral histories of the region and in the private letters of researchers who visited the area in the years that followed. It is the claim that before Kinkaid's expedition, before the article, before the alleged discovery, the Hopi elders had warned outsiders not to enter the lower tunnels. They said that the passages beneath the canyon were not places for the living. They said that those who entered without permission and without understanding would not return. And according to later accounts, 3 men connected to the Smithsonian, men whose names do not appear in any official expedition log, entered those tunnels in the months following the publication of the article, and they were never seen again. This is not a story that the Smithsonian acknowledges. It is not a story you will find in the institutional archives or the published records of early 20th century archaeology. But it is a story that has persisted in the oral tradition of the Hopi, in the private correspondence of regional historians, and in the fragmented notes of researchers who tried to follow up on the Phoenix Gazette article and found that every door they knocked on was closed. Tonight, we're going to walk through what is known, what is claimed, and what has been systematically ignored about the men who entered the lower tunnels in 1909 and the warnings they were given before they disappeared. If you value historical mysteries that institutions would rather you forget, take a moment now to subscribe and tap the like button. It costs you nothing, but it helps ensure that these stories reach the people who are willing to ask the questions no one else will ask. Now let us go back to 1909, to the Grand Canyon, and to the moment when a newspaper article opened a door that powerful people very quickly try to close. The Phoenix Gazette article of April 5th, 1909 is real. You can find it in newspaper archives. The digitized version exists in multiple databases, and the text is extraordinary in its level of detail. It describes G. Kinkaid as a seasoned explorer who had been contracted by the Smithsonian to conduct a geological survey of the Colorado River. According to the article, Kinkaid was traveling by boat through the canyon when he noticed, high on the cliff face, a cave entrance that appeared to be carved rather than natural. He climbed to the entrance and discovered that it led to a massive tunnel system extending deep into the rock. Inside, he claimed to find chambers filled with artifacts, statues with features that resembled Egyptian or Tibetan iconography, copper weapons, mummies stored in alcoves, and inscriptions in a language he could not identify. The article quotes Kinkaid as saying that he immediately contacted the Smithsonian and that Professor S.A. Jordan, the head of the institution's archaeology division, traveled to Arizona to personally oversee the excavation. It claims that Jordan assembled a team and that the team spent weeks documenting the site. And it suggests that the findings were so significant that they would require a complete revision of the understanding of pre-Columbian America. Then the story stops. No photographs were published. No artifacts were displayed. And within weeks, the Smithsonian issued a statement saying that they had no record of G. Kinkaid, no record of Professor S.A. Jordan, and no expedition to the Grand Canyon in 1909. For over 100 years, researchers have tried to verify the story. They have searched Smithsonian employment records. They have combed through expedition logs. They have requested access to archives. And they have found nothing. No Kinkaid, no Jordan, no Egyptian relics from the Grand Canyon. The standard conclusion, the one you will find in almost every mainstream historical account, is that the Phoenix Gazette article was a hoax, possibly written as sensational filler during a slow news week, possibly inspired by the popularity of Egyptology in the early 20th century, and certainly not based on any real discovery. But there are problems with that conclusion. The first problem is the level of detail. Hoax articles from this period tend to be vague and dramatic. This article was specific. It named locations. It described the terrain. It included quotes that, if fabricated, were fabricated by someone with knowledge of archaeological terminology and Smithsonian institutional structure. The second problem is that the article was never retracted. If it was known to be false, if the newspaper had been contacted by the Smithsonian and told that the story was nonsense, a retraction would have been standard practice. No retraction was published. The article simply stopped being discussed. And the third problem is the oral history of the Hopi, which has nothing to do with Egyptians or Kinkaid, but which has everything to do with the tunnels beneath the canyon and the warning not to enter them. The Hopi are a Puebloan people who have lived in the southwestern United States for over 1,000 years. Their oral tradition is precise, detailed, and verified by archaeological evidence in ways that have repeatedly surprised researchers who assumed that oral history was less reliable than written records. The Hopi described their origin as emerging from the underground, from a previous world that existed below the surface of the current one. The exact location of the Sipapu, the place of emergence, is not shared with outsiders, but it is described as a tunnel system that connects to chambers deep within the earth. And the Hopi have made clear, in every generation, that these tunnels are not to be entered by those who do not have the knowledge or the permission to do so. In the early 20th century, when archaeologists and treasure hunters began arriving in the Southwest in large numbers, the Hopi elders repeated this warning. They told the outsiders that the lower tunnels were not safe. They did not provide detailed explanations, because the reasons were considered sacred and internal to the Hopi tradition. But they were consistent in saying that people who entered without understanding would not come back. Most of the outsiders ignored this. They assumed it was superstition, a way of protecting sites from looters, or a vague warning about cave-ins and getting lost. But some of the people who lived in the region, the ranchers and the guides, and the local traders who had been there long enough to see patterns, understood that the Hopi warnings were not vague. They were specific, and people who ignored them had, in fact, disappeared. Here is where the revisionist history starts to matter, because the story of the 3 Smithsonian men is not in the Phoenix Gazette article. It appears in sources that are harder to verify, but that are consistent across multiple accounts. The first reference to the disappearance appears in a letter written in 1911 by a trader named Samuel Whitmore, who operated a post near the Hopi mesas. Whitmore's letter, which is held in a private collection and has never been fully published, describes a conversation he had with a Hopi elder who told him that after the newspaper men came asking about the canyon tunnels, 3 white men arrived claiming to be from Washington. They asked questions about the entrances to the lower passages. They were told not to enter. They entered anyway, and they did not come back. Whitmore's letter does not name the men. It does not provide dates beyond the summer after the newspaper story, and it does not claim to have witnessed the disappearance himself. But it is consistent with other fragmentary accounts that appear in the journals of regional historians and in the unpublished field notes of anthropologists who worked with the Hopi in the 1920s and 30s. Multiple sources, none of them coordinated, describe the same basic story. 3 men, connected in some way to the Smithsonian or to an institution in Washington, entered the tunnels beneath the Grand Canyon area after being warned not to and were never seen again. The institutional response to these claims has been absolute and consistent denial. The Smithsonian has stated repeatedly that they have no record of any such expedition, no record of missing employees, and no record of any investigation into disappearances in the Grand Canyon in 1909 or the years following. And if you are operating from the assumption that institutions keep complete and honest records, that denial would be the end of the story. But if you are operating from the knowledge that institutions routinely suppress, lose, or destroy records that are inconvenient, then the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Let's talk about what the Hopi actually believe about the tunnels, because this is not a matter of vague superstition. The Hopi cosmology describes multiple worlds. The current world, the fourth world, is the one we live in now. But the Hopi emerged into this world from the third world, which existed below. The Sipapu, the opening through which the people climbed, is described as a physical location, not a metaphor. And the tunnels that connect to it are described as real, as dangerous, and as protected by forces that are not friendly to those who enter without proper knowledge or intent. The elders do not describe what those forces are in terms that outsiders can easily understand, because the knowledge is internal to Hopi practice. But they are clear that the tunnels are not abandoned ruins. They are not empty caves. They are active in a sense that matters spiritually and practically, and entering them is not a neutral act. When the archaeologists and the treasure hunters began arriving in the early 1900s, they did not take this seriously. They assumed that any story about danger in the tunnels was either a deterrent to keep outsiders away from sacred sites, or a misunderstanding of natural hazards like bad air, unstable rock, or the risk of getting lost in a complex cave system. And in some cases, that assumption was correct. People did get lost. People did encounter bad air. But there were also cases documented in the regional newspapers of the time of people who entered cave systems in the Grand Canyon area and who vanished in ways that could not be easily explained by getting lost or injured. In 1910, a prospector named Edwin Fuller entered a cave system near the Little Colorado River, looking for turquoise. He told the people at the trading post where he was going. He brought supplies for a week. He was experienced with caves and had been exploring the region for years. He did not return. A search party went looking for him 2 weeks later. They found his camp at the entrance to the cave. His supplies were untouched. His equipment was neatly arranged. But there was no sign of Fuller, no trail leading away from the camp, and no indication that he had ever entered the cave. The search party went into the cave system. They found nothing. No body, no gear, no evidence that Fuller had been there at all. The official conclusion was that he had wandered off and died somewhere in the desert, and that animals had scattered his remains. But the people who knew Fuller said that made no sense. He was not the kind of man to wander off. And the Hopi, when asked, said simply that he had been warned and that he had not listened. There are other cases. In 1912, 2 men from Flagstaff, amateur archaeologists looking for artifacts to sell, entered a cave system on the south rim of the canyon. They were seen entering by a Navajo shepherd. They were never seen leaving. Their families reported them missing. A search was conducted. The entrance to the cave they had entered was found and examined. There was no sign of a collapse, no sign of a struggle, and no indication that the men had ever come back out. The case was recorded as a missing persons case. It was never solved. The pattern is this: people enter. People do not return. Searches find nothing. And the official record either attributes it to natural causes or leaves it unsolved. But the Hopi, in their oral tradition, are consistent in saying that the lower tunnels are not safe for outsiders, that the warnings are not metaphorical, and that the people who ignore them pay a price that the outside world does not understand. Now, let us return to the 3 Smithsonian men. The most detailed account of their disappearance comes from the field notes of an anthropologist named Dr. Harold Colton, who worked extensively with the Hopi in the 1920s and 30s and who founded the Museum of Northern Arizona. Colton's published work does not mention the Smithsonian disappearance, but his unpublished notes, which are held in the museum's archives, include a conversation he had in 1927 with a Hopi elder named Ukuma. According to Colton's notes, Ukuma told him that in the time after the big newspaper lie about the canyon, 3 men came to the mesas. They said they were from the school in Washington. They want to know about the tunnels. Ukuma, who was young at the time but old enough to remember, said that the elders told the men not to go into the lower passages. The men did not listen. They hired a guide from a different tribe, someone who did not know the warnings or did not care. And they entered. The guide came back 2 days later. The 3 men did not. Colton asked what happened to the guide. Ukuma said the guide would not speak about it. He took his payment and left the area and was never seen again. Colton asked what the elders believed had happened to the three men. Yukuma said they had gone where they were not supposed to go, and that the earth had taken them back. Colton pressed for more detail. Yukuma said that was all that outsiders needed to know, and that if Colton was wise, he would stop asking about the lower tunnels. Colton did stop asking. He never published this conversation. He never followed up on it. And when he wrote about Hopi traditions in his later work, he focused on the aspects that were considered acceptable for public discussion and avoided the topics that the elders had made clear were not for outsiders. This is the pattern that repeats across the early anthropological literature. Researchers encountered stories and warnings that did not fit their frameworks. They recorded them in private notes, and then they moved on, because pursuing those stories would have required taking Indigenous testimony seriously in ways that the academic institutions of the time are not willing to do. The question we're left with is what actually happened to the three men. If they existed, if they entered the tunnels, if they disappeared. The skeptical position is that the entire story is apocryphal, that there were no Smithsonian men, that the disappearance is a legend that grew out of the Phoenix Gazette hoax, and that the Hopi accounts are either misremembered or misinterpreted. The believer position is that the men were real, that they were part of a covert Smithsonian operation to recover the artifacts described in the newspaper, and that they encountered something in the tunnels that killed them or trapped them. But there's a third position, the one that the Hopi themselves seem to hold, which is that the men entered a space that was not meant for them, and that what happened to them is not a mystery in the sense that outsiders understand mysteries. It is simply the consequence of ignoring a boundary that should not have been crossed. The Hopi do not describe the lower tunnels as haunted in the Western sense. They do not talk about ghosts or curses. They talk about the tunnels as part of a living cosmology, as places that are connected to the previous world and to the forces that govern the transition between worlds. Entering those places without the proper knowledge, without the proper intent, and without the proper preparation is described not as breaking a rule, but as stepping outside the structure of reality in a way that reality does not tolerate. The people who do this are not punished. They are simply removed from the world they try to leave. If that sounds like mysticism to a modern ear, consider that the Hopi understanding of these places has been consistent for over 1,000 years, and that the people who have ignored the warnings have, in documented cases, disappeared. You can dismiss that as coincidence. You can attribute it to natural hazards. Or you can consider the possibility that the Hopi know something about the landscape they have lived on for a millennium that outsiders, arriving with maps and equipment and assumptions, do not know and cannot learn in a few weeks or months. The institutional archaeology of the early 20th century was not interested in that possibility. It was interested in artifacts, in provable claims, in discoveries that could be displayed in museums, and that would enhance the reputation of the institutions that funded the expeditions. A warning from Indigenous elders that certain places should not be entered was, from that perspective, either superstition or an obstacle to be worked around. And so the warnings were ignored, and people disappeared, and the institutions that sent them did not acknowledge the disappearances, because acknowledging them would have required acknowledging that the warnings had been real. The Phoenix Gazette article, whether it was true or false, created a problem for the Smithsonian. If the article was true, then the Smithsonian had discovered evidence of a pre-Columbian civilization in North America that did not fit the accepted timeline, and they were suppressing it. If the article was false, then the Smithsonian's name had been attached to a hoax, and they needed to distance themselves from it. Either way, the institutional response was to deny everything. No Kinkaid, no Jordan, no expedition, no artifacts. And if, in the process of that denial, a few men went missing while trying to follow up on the story, then those disappearances would also be denied or attributed to unrelated causes, because admitting that employees had been sent into dangerous territory based on a story the institution was publicly disavowing would have been a liability. The Phoenix Gazette article, whether it was true or false, created a problem for the Smithsonian. If the article was true, then the Smithsonian had discovered evidence of a pre-Columbian civilization in North America that did not fit the accepted timeline, and they were suppressing it. If the article was false, then the Smithsonian's name had been attached to a hoax, and they needed to distance themselves from it. Either way, the institutional response was to deny everything. No Kinkaid, no Jordan, no expedition, no artifacts. And if in the process of that denial, a few men went missing while trying to follow up on the story, then those disappearances would also be denied or attributed to unrelated causes, because admitting that employees had been sent into dangerous territory based on a story the institution was publicly disavowing would have been a liability. This is the structure of suppression. It is not a conspiracy in the sense of a coordinated cover-up. It is simply the rational behavior of an institution protecting its reputation and avoiding legal and financial consequences. The men who disappeared, if they existed, were probably not on the official payroll. They were probably contractors, guides, or researchers working on temporary agreements. Their disappearance would not trigger the same institutional response as the loss of a tenured employee. And if the families of those men asked questions, they would have been told that the institution had no record of their employment and no responsibility for their fate. The records, if they ever existed, would have been filed away or destroyed. And within a generation, the whole thing would be forgotten, except in the oral tradition of the people who had warned them not to go. We are left with fragments. The Phoenix Gazette article, the letters of Samuel Whitmore, the field notes of Harold Colton, the consistent oral history of the Hopi that the lower tunnels are not to be entered, and the absence of any institutional acknowledgement that people were lost trying to verify a story that the institution claims never happened. If you're looking for proof, you will not find it. The proof, if it exists, is in archives that are not open to the public, or in records that were destroyed, or in the oral tradition of a people who have learned, through bitter experience, not to share certain knowledge with outsiders who will not respect it. But the absence of proof is not the same as the absence of truth. The tunnels are real. The Hopi warnings are real. The disappearances, documented in regional newspapers and private letters, are real. And the institutional denial is real. What connects all of these pieces is the refusal of the outside world to take seriously the knowledge of the people who have lived on this land for over 1,000 years. The Hopi said not to enter. The outsiders entered. And the earth, as Eucumus said, took them back. The lesson here is not that there is a hidden Egyptian city in the Grand Canyon. The lesson is that the Hopi were right and the institutions were wrong, and the cost of that wrongness was paid by the people who trusted the institutions more than they trusted the warnings. The Smithsonian, if it sent men into those tunnels, did so because it believed that its methods, its equipment, and its institutional authority were superior to the knowledge of the indigenous people who had been managing and understanding that landscape for a millennium. And if those men disappeared, the institution did not mourn them publicly. It erased them, because admitting the loss would have been admitting the mistake. And institutions do not admit mistakes when they can avoid it. The tunnels are still there. The warnings are still there. And the Hopi, to this day, do not speak openly about the lower passages, because they understand that the outside world is not listening with the intent to understand. It is listening with the intent to exploit. And every time that has happened, something has been lost. Sometimes it is an artifact. Sometimes it is a sacred site. And sometimes it is a person who entered where they were not supposed to go and who never came back. The 3 men, whoever they were, are part of that loss now. Their names are not in the institutional record. Their families, if they existed, have long since stopped asking. And the story of what happened to them exists only in the spaces between the official denials, in the oral history that the Hopi have chosen not to share in full, and the field notes of researchers who heard the story and decided it was safer not to pursue it. That is the cost of institutional arrogance. It is paid in lives that are forgotten, in knowledge that is dismissed, and in warnings that are ignored until it is too late. The Hopi told them not to enter. They entered, and the only people who remember are the ones who were never supposed to forget.